The coordinates were wrong. I knew at the moment the transit pod doors opened and I was standing on polished obsidian floor instead of packed greenhouse soil. The air smelled like metal and old ceremony, not like plants, not like anything alive. I checked my scanner, checked it again. The device blinked at me like it was also confused and also not sorry about it. My name is Marcus Vale. I am 34 years old. I spent 6 years as a trauma nurse in 2 of the worst conflict zones humanity had managed to produce, survived both, burned completely through whatever it was that made me useful in those places, and then signed up with the Interstellar Humanitarian Corps, because apparently I had not yet reached my personal limit for bad decisions. My assignment on Veth Prime was botanical, soil surveys, nutrient mapping, maybe some light documentation of local agricultural deficiencies so the Corps could file a 12-page report that 3 people would read. It was supposed to be quiet. It was supposed to be the kind of work where the most dangerous thing you encountered was a root vegetable with an attitude problem. Instead, I was standing in a corridor wide enough to land a shuttle in, holding a clipboard and a soil probe, while 2 Imperial guards stared at me like I was the strangest thing the universe had produced so far. I said, "I think I'm in the wrong wing." Neither of them responded. The Veth don't do small talk. They do silence the way other species do, whether constantly and with total commitment. One of them spoke into a comm device on his wrist. The other kept staring at me. I stared back because I was raised in Chicago and we do not look away first. A third figure appeared from a side corridor, a palace official in ceremonial gray, moving with the particular walk of someone who had spent centuries being important. He looked at my clipboard. He looked at my boots. He looked at my face with an expression that said he was cataloging me the way I was supposed to be cataloging plants. "You are the human survey worker," he said, not a question. "Marcus Vale, IHC Xenobotany Division." I held up my credentials. "I think my transit coordinates got corrupted. I'm supposed to be in the Eastern Greenhouse Complex." "You are in the Imperial Residential Anteroom," he said, like that explained the geometry of the universe. "Section 7. This section is restricted." "I can see that. I'd love to leave." He did not move to help me leave. He looked at the corridor behind him instead, a long, arched passage that ended in a pair of doors tall enough to make a person feel like an insect. And then he looked back at me with the particular expression of someone calculating a problem they had not anticipated this morning. "You will wait," he said. I waited. The doors at the end of the corridor were not entirely closed. There was a gap maybe 2 inches, and through it I could see light that was different from the corridor light, warmer, gold-toned, the kind of light that gets designed rather than just installed. And then I saw her. She was on a raised platform on the far side of the room. That is the most neutral way I can describe it. She was standing on a dais in the way that statues stand, completely still, completely arranged, every part of her positioned with a precision that did not come from comfort. It came from practice, long, grinding practice, the kind that stops being conscious and becomes structural. She was tall. The Veth are tall as a species, but she was tall even for them. Her bioluminescent markings, pale gold lines that ran from her temples down along her jaw and neck and disappeared into her ceremonial collar, were brighter than the ones I had seen on ordinary Veth citizens in the transit terminals. Everything about her was more color, more stillness, more presence. There were 6 courtiers in the room with her. They were talking at length with gestures, with data tablets, with the focused energy of people making decisions. None of them were talking to her. They were talking around her, about her, referencing her the way you reference a piece of architecture you are renovating. She stood in the middle of all of it and looked at nothing. Until she looked at me. It was the gap in the door. She could see the gap and I was standing in it. Our eyes met through 2 inches of space across a room the size of a small stadium. She did not look away. That was what landed on me first. She did not do the thing that every Veth citizen I had encountered did when they accidentally made contact with an outsider. She did not disengage and recalibrate and find a polite excuse to look elsewhere. She just looked, steady, without performance. I had done 6 years of trauma intake. I knew how to read stillness. There is the stillness of people who are calm and the stillness of people who have learned to make themselves small so nothing notices them. Those are not the same thing. They look alike from a distance. They do not feel alike up close. I felt it from 30 feet away, through a 2-inch gap in a door. The official returned before I could process much else. He informed me that my transit error had been logged, that my credentials had been verified, that I was cleared to depart, and that my reassignment to the correct greenhouse coordinates would be processed within the hour. He said all of this in the smooth, unbroken tone of someone who was also, very politely, telling me never to come back. I followed him out. I did not look back through the door gap. I thought about it later. In my transit bunk that night, with my soil survey data open on the screen in front of me and absolutely none of it going into my brain, I thought about the stillness, the arranged hands, the way no one in that room had directed a single word at her while she stood in the center of it. I had heard that sentence before, in different buildings on different planets. The one the gray official said when I asked, professionally and casually, about the living conditions of the individual I had accidentally glimpsed. The princess does not need anything. She is provided for. In a Sector 4 refugee processing center, they said it about families in intake blocks. In a field hospital outside a collapsed city, they said it about patients on lower priority beds. Provided for is what you say when you want to close a question without answering it. I opened a new file on my survey tablet. I titled it, Extended Atmospheric and Botanical Survey, Interior Palace Complex, Western and Central Wings, pending authorization. I wrote a justification paragraph that was technically accurate and implied nothing specific. I filed the extension request that night. It was approved 4 days later because I was a Grade 3 species diplomat-adjacent worker, and the Veth Imperial Administration had categorized humans as too minor to bother restricting carefully. Nobody important read the request. Nobody important thought the human botanist needed supervision. That was their first mistake. I had made a career, 2 wars, and 1 spectacular burnout out of being underestimated. I was not going back to just the greenhouse. The interior palace garden was not what I expected. I had been in alien botanical spaces before: the sculpted, pressurized dome gardens of the Herath station, the wild, unpruned growth corridors of the Solin homeworld. Those places had personality. You could feel what the people who built them valued. The Herath loved geometry. The Solin loved mess. The Veth Palace garden was perfect. Every plant was exactly the right height. Every path was exactly the right width. The soil, when I tested it, and I tested it immediately, because I had legitimate work to do and also because kneeling in dirt gave me something to do with my hands, was nutrient balanced to a level that suggested careful, regular monitoring by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Which made it strange that the phosphate levels in the northeast quadrant were slightly off. Not dangerously off, not visibly off, but I had a good scanner and the patience that comes from having nothing else scheduled, and I noticed. I was recalibrating my probe angle, trying to get a clean read through the dense root structure of a ground-covering vine, when a shadow fell across my work. I looked up. She was standing 3 feet away. No courtiers, no guards, or rather, 2 guards at the garden entrance, which was far enough away to constitute the closest thing to a loan she probably got. She was wearing something less ceremonial than before. The gold line markings on her face were slightly dimmer in the morning light, the way a screen dims when it is not in active mode. She was looking at my probe with an expression that, on a human face, I would have called critical. "You are doing it wrong," she said. The galactic standard was perfect, no accent, no hesitation, the kind of fluency that comes from having had nothing to do for a very long time except learn things. I said, "Probably, you a botanist." She paused, not a polite pause, a genuine one. The pause of someone who had been asked a direct question by a person who expected a real answer and was not sure what to do with that expectation. "I have studied the Imperial Botanical Records extensively," she said. "All 312 volumes." "So yes," I said. Another pause. "Yes," she said, like the word was a door she was testing the weight of. I shifted the probe angle. She watched for a moment, then crouched beside me, a movement that was so natural and so immediate that I got the sense it surprised her too, and adjusted the probe 2 degrees clockwise with 2 fingers. The reading cleaned up completely. Phosphate levels clear, root depth accurate, the vine was fine. I wrote the reading in my survey log. I wrote, "Probe adjustment per consultation, Saravin DHO, Imperial Botanical Records Specialist." I kept writing, she went still. Not the arranged stillness of the dais. Different. The stillness of someone who has just seen their name written in a sentence that treated it like a source of information rather than a designation of property. "You wrote my name," she said. "You gave me accurate data. I cite my sources." I moved to the next test point. "You want to check the calcium levels in this section. They felt low to me on the way in." She did not answer right away, but she moved with me to the next section. We worked for 40 minutes. She knew the garden the way people know the backs of their own hands, not because she had tended it, she told me, but because it was the only outdoor space she was permitted to use, and she had memorized it the way captive things memorize the dimensions of their available space. She did not say it like that. She said it matter-of-factly, but the sentence was the same sentence. I did not react to it. I wrote her observations in the log. On my third scheduled morning in the garden, she was there before me. She had left something near the northeast vine, a small, flat mineral disc, deep blue-green, the kind you find in the deeper palace quarry layers. No note, no explanation, just the object. I put it in my sample kit and cataloged it as a geological specimen. On the 5th morning, she left a marked page from an Imperial Botanical Codex. An old page. The paper was thick and slightly yellowed at the edges. The marked section described the vine's root communication system. The margin had a single annotation in tight, precise script. I read it, then I read it again. The annotation said, "This is how it talks to the others without making sound." I put the page carefully in my field folder. I did not say anything about it when I saw her the next morning, but I started leaving things too. My core ration bar on the first day, a human food item she had never seen. A small recording chip the day after, loaded with ambient audio I had on my personal files. She picked up the ration bar like it might have opinions about being touched. She picked up the recording chip carefully and held it and looked at me. "What does it contain?" she asked. "Rain," I said. "Earth rain. It rains a lot where I grew up." She looked at the chip for a long time. Then she put it in the small interior pocket of her outer garment, not in a bag, in a pocket that was close to her. The following Tuesday I arrived at the garden, and she was not there. I waited, set up my equipment, started the morning readings. She was always there before me or arrived within the first 10 minutes. 40 minutes in, one of the entrance guards approached me, which was unusual, and informed me with carefully neutral face that the princess would not be attending the garden this morning. He did not say why. His face said he was not going to say why. I finished my soil survey. I stayed the full scheduled time. I sat in the northeast quadrant near the vine she had adjusted the probe for and did my data entry work, which I could have done anywhere, which I had no real reason to do there specifically. I stayed because the garden had a sight line to the third-level interior windows. I could not see her. I had no way of knowing if she could see me. I stayed anyway. When I found out the next morning what had happened, through the kind of quiet, sideways information flow that happens in any institutional setting when someone wants you to know something without being caught telling you, I sat with it for a while before reacting. She had spoken to me without a court-approved interpreter present during our third session. A minor infraction, technically. The kind of rule that exists as infrastructure, not enforced usually, but available to be enforced when convenient. Someone had found it convenient. I went back to my transit bunk. I opened my IHC Accords manual, the full document, 1,200 pages, which I had never read entirely because no one ever needed to, and I started at the beginning. There was something I was looking for. I was fairly sure I was going to find it. I found it on page 407. Clause 19, Section C, Subarticle 3 of the Interstellar Humanitarian Accords, the sapient being in confined circumstance provision, written 40 years ago for prisoners of war in the Harath-Donal conflict, never updated, never species limited, never given an exemption clause for voluntary ceremonial retreat, because no one writing it had imagined that a category of captivity would exist that wore gold and stood on a dais, and was not officially called captivity at all. The provision was simple. Any sapient being whose freedom of movement, communication, and self-determination were restricted by an external authority, regardless of the nature or stated purpose of that restriction, was entitled to welfare assessment by a neutral humanitarian party. I was a neutral humanitarian party. I was standing in the empire that had restricted her. And humans were classified as grade 3 minor species under Veth imperial law, which meant I had movement freedoms that a higher classified species would not have had, because the Veth legal architecture had never taken us seriously enough to write proper restrictions. I love being underestimated. I filed the welfare assessment request formally through the IHC legal channel at 600 on a Wednesday morning. I attached the full Accords text, the relevant clauses highlighted, and a 12-point supporting brief that I had spent 3 days writing and which was, I felt, some of my best work. The Veth imperial legal body received it, reviewed it, and convened a full council to dismiss it. They could not dismiss it. I know this because the response came back 8 days later not as a dismissal, but as a procedural hold pending species classification review, which is legal language for, we are looking for the exit and cannot find it. The clause had no species exemption. It had no political status exemption. It had no, but she is a princess, and this is technically a palace exemption. It said sapient being. She was a sapient being. The assessment was valid. 3 Veth legal scholars worked for 2 weeks on the counterargument. They came back with nothing. I received authorized, supervised, weekly welfare check access to the princess. Documented, official, stamped with an imperial seal that I was fairly sure several senior court officials had signed while in a state of profound irritation. I brought something different every time. The first session I brought a standard core welfare intake form and filled it out with her, which is exactly as thrilling as it sounds, but which required her to answer direct questions about her daily conditions, her access to information, her communication freedoms. She answered every question with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime measuring words before releasing them. I wrote down exactly what she said. I gave her a copy. She looked at the copy for a long time. Her own words about her own life, recorded and attributed to her, existing as a document. "What does this do?" she asked. "It goes on record," I said. "With the IHC, with the Accords Registry, it means what you said happened. It means it is not just my word or their word. It is your word." She folded the copy with both hands, precise folds. She did not put it down. The second session, I brought a data tablet loaded with access to the IHC General Library. non-classified, non-restricted, the kind of library that any core worker had on their personal device as standard issue. It had about 4 million texts, translated into galactic standard, covering everything from agricultural science to music theory to the complete recorded oral histories of 11 sapient species. I handed it to her and said she could keep it until my next visit. She held it in both hands and looked at it the way people look at things they are afraid to want too much. "This is permitted?" she asked. "I didn't ask," I said. "The Accords say I can provide informational materials during welfare assessment sessions. This is informational materials." "You use the rules the way water uses cracks," she said. That one landed. I thought about it for a week. Third session, I brought rain. Not the recording chip. I had already given her that. I brought a small portable atmospheric unit from the core equipment cache, the kind used in dry climate field operations to add humidity to a working space, and I loaded it with the closest approximation to Earth rain pattern that I could program. Soft, irregular, the kind of rain that does not fall in straight lines. I set it up in the corner of the assessment room and turned it on. She went completely still. Not the trained stillness, something different. The stillness of a person whose entire sensory attention has been captured by something unexpected and real. "It sounds alive," she said after a while. "It kind of is," I said. "On Earth it comes from the ocean. The water evaporates, travels hundreds of miles as clouds, and then falls again. The same water cycling. Every rain is the same water as some other rain that happened somewhere else a long time ago." She listened to it for the entire session. She did not ask many questions that day. She just sat with it. Near the end, she said, "This is the first thing that was only for me." I had been writing notes. My handwriting went wrong on the next 3 lines. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not have made it smaller, so I let it be what it was. The situation at the court level was less quiet. I had a supervisor call from the IHC regional coordinator, a woman named Carol, who had the voice of someone who had been managing field workers for 30 years and had stopped being surprised by almost anything, asking me to characterize my current operations on Veth Prime. I characterized them as botanical survey work with welfare assessment supplementation, fully compliant with the Accords. Carol said, "Marcus, I have received 4 formal inquiries from the Imperial Chamberlain's office this week." 4 seems like a lot, I agreed. "They want to know if your activities can be reclassified under cultural exchange protocols, which would remove your Accord standing." "They can want that," I said. "The assessment is already on record. The first session's documentation is filed and registered. They cannot unfile it." There was a pause. "You are being very careful," Carol said. "I'm a botanist," I said. "We're methodical." Another pause. "Marcus." "Yes." "What is actually happening over there?" I looked at my session notes. 3 months of weekly visits. A folded welfare form that she had not put down for 2 days according to the guard's own log, which I had requested under Accord's transparency provisions. A library tablet that had been accessed for an average of 9 hours per day. A rain sound that a being who had lived for 300 years called the first thing that was only for her. "Botanical survey work," I said, "with some complications." Carol made the sound of someone deciding not to push further. "Be careful," she said. "Veth imperial politics are old and patient, and they do not forget." "Neither do I," I said, "and I have better documentation." The move came on a Tuesday. Of course it did. Things that are designed to feel inevitable always happen on ordinary days. I received the formal notification at 800. The Imperial Administrative Bureau had completed a reclassification review of the princess's residential status. Effective immediately, her quarters, her garden access, and her ceremonial obligations were collectively designated as a voluntary devotional retreat under the Imperial Cultural Heritage Preservation Act. Voluntary. I read the word 3 times. The 4th time I read it, I got up, made a strong cup of core-issue coffee, and read the full text of the Imperial Cultural Heritage Preservation Act. It was long, dense, old, parts of it dated back over 4 centuries. The language was formal and layered the way very old legal documents are layered, built up over generations of amendments and annotations, until the original architecture was almost invisible underneath. I read it anyway. I found what I was looking for on page 112. The Veth dynastic legal system, the foundational law that predated the Cultural Heritage Act by nearly 2 centuries, contained a provision called the Spoken Assent Clause. It was ancient. It had been written for a specific political context that had not existed for a very long time, which meant it had also not been actively applied for a very long time, which meant no one had thought to put an expiration date on it. The Spoken Assent Clause stated that any change to the status or classification of a member of the imperial bloodline required their explicit verbal agreement, spoken before witnesses, in open session. Any change, including a reclassification that was designed to look like it was protecting her interests. The voluntary devotional retreat designation required her voice, her actual voice, saying yes. I filed a procedural challenge to the reclassification at 1400 on that same Tuesday. I attached the Spoken Assent Clause, the original dynastic law text, a legal analysis I had written in 4 hours that I was fairly proud of, and a formal request that the princess be given the opportunity to provide verbal assent in open session, as required by her own empire's founding law. By 1700 I had a response. The challenge had been accepted for review. The reclassification was on hold. By 1900 I had a second notification. I was summoned to appear before the imperial court the following morning. I ironed my corps uniform. I polished my credentials badge. I went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept better than I expected. The imperial court chamber was the largest interior space I had ever stood in. The ceiling was so far overhead it was its own weather system. The floor was that same polished obsidian I had landed on the day I took the wrong transit pod, but here it stretched in all directions and reflected the ceremonial lighting until the room seemed to contain 2 of itself. There were about 60 people present: court officials, legal representatives, chamberlain staff, senior palace administrators, 2 members of what I recognized as the Imperial Intelligence Bureau, who I had not expected but was not surprised by. I stood in the center of it with my clipboard, because I had brought my clipboard and I was keeping it. The chamberlain, the same one I had called my guy 3 months ago, who had not forgotten, whose face told me he had not forgotten, addressed me from an elevated position at the far end of the chamber. "Marcus Vale," he said, "IHC Grade 3 Species Worker. You have filed 17 separate accords provisions, 14 procedural requests, and 1 legal challenge against an imperial administrative decision in the space of 93 days. 94, I said, as of this morning. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a room full of people decides simultaneously not to react. You have exceeded your survey authorization considerably, the chamberlain said. I have stayed within the bounds of my accord standing at every step, I said, which I can document. I have documented it. I brought the documentation. I held up the folder under my clipboard, all 94 days of it. The Imperial Bureau has reviewed your welfare assessment activities and found them to be disruptive. Disruptive to what specifically? I asked, not aggressively, genuinely. I wanted him to say it out loud in the documented session. He did not say it out loud. Instead, he shifted. The court shifted with him. the subtle readjustment of people preparing for the part of the conversation they actually came for. "We are prepared to offer you a formal appointment," the Chamberlain said. "The position of Imperial Xenobiological Consul, a senior diplomatic designation with full palace access, residential quarters within the complex, and substantial resource allocation for your research." The room waited. It was elegant. I will give them that. The position would bring me under Veth imperial jurisdiction. My IHC standing would become secondary to my imperial designation. My accord's provisions would be subordinate to imperial administrative law. Every tool I had built over 94 days would be in their hands, not mine. I would have full palace access and no independent standing to use it. I said I accept. The room did not move. But the atmosphere changed in the way that a room changes when 60 people are all thinking the same thing at once, and none of them are going to say it. The Chamberlain had not expected that. I smiled at him, which was the most unsettling thing I could have done, and I knew it, and I did it anyway. Before he could speak again, before he could move to the next procedural step that would lock the new designation in place and neutralize my standing, a sound happened. A voice. From the left side of the chamber, where a secondary gallery existed that I had not fully examined when I entered, behind a lattice screen that I now understood was not decorative. She said my name. Marcus. One word, 2 syllables. The room went so still I could hear the climate system in the ceiling. The Veth do not speak out of turn in court session. It is not a rule that gets broken because it is not a rule that anyone has needed to enforce in living memory. You do not need to enforce a wall that has never been tested. She had tested it. She had spoken without being addressed, in a full court session, in a hall where she had stood as background architecture for her entire adult life, and she had said my name, not a title, not a formal address. My name, the way people say names when they are using them as anchors. I looked at the latticed screen. I could see the outline of her through it. She was standing. She had been sitting. I had seen the shape of a seated figure when I came in, and she had stood up to speak. The Chamberlain was very still. The Intelligence Bureau officials were exchanging a look that I catalogued and stored for later. I turned back to the Chamberlain. "I accept the consultancy," I said again, steadily. "And as my first action under the consultancy designation, I will need to complete the outstanding procedural requirements of my accord's welfare assessment, including the verbal assent review required under the spoken assent clause for the pending reclassification." He could not refuse. I was now, technically, an imperial consultant with the authority to complete outstanding authorized work. The accord's assessment was authorized work. The spoken assent review was a legal requirement under their own law. He said he would take it under review. I said that was fine, and that I would be available at his convenience. I walked out of the chamber. My boots were very loud on the obsidian floor. I counted my steps and kept my face forward and did not allow any of what was sitting in my chest to show until I was through the outer doors and standing alone in the corridor outside. Then I stood there for a moment. She had said my name. In that room, in front of all of them, after 300 years of silence that was not chosen. I had been a trauma nurse. I had watched people fight very hard for very small things, the ability to sit up on their own, the first meal they ate themselves, the first time they walked to the door and back without help. I knew what it cost to do something that looked small and was not small at all. I took a breath. Then I went to find an office, because I was now an imperial consultant, and I had a reclassification challenge to formally complete and a window requisition to file, because I had made a promise. A window that opened. I was going to deliver on it. The window took 11 days. Not because it was technically difficult. The palace structural engineers confirmed it was a simple modification, standard framing, no load-bearing interference. 11 days because of the approval chain. 7 separate administrative offices, each requiring sign-off from the one above it, each staffed by people who had never processed a window request for the princess's wing, because it had never occurred to anyone that a window in that wing should open. I tracked the request through every office personally. I showed up. I sat in waiting areas. I asked politely how the review was proceeding. I was cheerful about it in a way that I had been told, more than once in my life, was somehow more unsettling than anger. On day 11, the modification was approved and completed. I was there when the palace technician finished the work, a simple hinge assembly on the inner frame, nothing dramatic, and stepped back. The window could open now. It was not open. It was just a window that, for the first time, had that option. I told her the next morning, in the assessment session. I said, "The window in the northeast corner of your second-level residence can now be opened. It has been cleared by facilities and approved by administration. You can open it whenever you choose." She looked at me for a moment. "Whenever I choose," she said. "That's the idea," I said. She did not say anything else about the window in that session. But 2 days later, the guard log, which I still had access to under the Accord's assessment standing, which was still technically active while my consultancy designation processed, noted that the window had been opened at 4:30 in the morning and had remained open for 3 hours. 4:30, before anyone else in the palace was moving, just her and a window and whatever came through it. I did not mention that I had seen the log entry. Some things are not for documentation. My consultancy designation was confirmed in full at the end of the 4th week. Imperial Xenobiological Consul, as offered, full palace access, research resources, residential quarters within the complex, all of it. What the Chamberlain had not anticipated, what the Intelligence Bureau officials whose exchanged look I had catalogued had also not anticipated, was what I did with the consultancy calendar. A consultant, under Veth Imperial Administrative Law, had the authority to schedule research engagement sessions with any palace resident who possessed relevant domain expertise. The princess had extensive documented expertise in imperial botanical records. I had established this documentation across 4 months of welfare assessment sessions. I scheduled research engagement sessions 3 times a week. The sessions were not restricted to the assessment room. Research engagement sessions could take place in any suitable research environment, which I interpreted as broadly as the language allowed, and the language, written originally for scientific consultants examining palace collections, allowed very broadly indeed. I scheduled the first external session for a Tuesday morning. Listed location: Palace Exterior Botanical Survey Area, Western Terrace level. The Western Terrace was outside. Not the interior garden. Not a contained space with a ceiling and a perimeter guard. The Western Terrace was an exterior platform, open to the Veth Prime sky, used occasionally by maintenance staff and never by anyone from the residential wing. I submitted the scheduling request on a Friday. It processed over the weekend without a flag, because the weekend administrative staff were not the same people as the weekday staff who might have recognized what was happening, and the automated approval system did not contain a restriction for exterior research locations because, again, no one had thought to write one. The approval confirmation arrived at 700 Monday morning. I did not tell her in advance. I did not want to give the palace administration time to find the gap in their own approval. I told her Tuesday morning when I arrived for the session that we were relocating, that it had been cleared, that she should bring a coat if she had one because the upper terrace levels ran cold. She looked at me. "Outside," she said. "The survey data on upper-level atmospheric botanical distribution has a gap in it," I said. "I need a research assistant familiar with the palace grounds. You are documented as exactly that." She put on a coat. The two guards who accompanied us were following their standard protocol, which covered interior palace movement, and were operating on the approved session documentation, which was technically correct. They were not prepared to argue with paperwork that bore an imperial administrative seal. We took 3 corridors and 1 lift to the terrace level. The doors at the end were heavy, external grade, pressure-sealed, and they required a manual release that I had familiarized myself with the previous Thursday during a solo survey run I had logged as upper-level atmospheric moisture baseline assessment. I pressed the release, the seal disengaged, the doors swung out. The sky over Veth Prime is not like Earth's sky. It does not do the blue thing. It is a deep, layered gray-purple, with a quality of light that comes from the binary system, the primary star giving gold, the secondary giving something closer to silver, and in the morning hours they angle against each other in a way that makes the atmosphere look like it is thinking. She stepped through the doors. She stopped moving the moment she was fully outside. The wind on the terrace was low and consistent, coming from the northwest across the upper palace levels. It moved across her face. She turned into it slightly, the way people turn toward warmth or sound not consciously, but because something in the body knows what it needs. She looked up. I have seen a lot of things in my life that required me to hold my face still. I am good at holding my face still. I held my face still. She stood in the wind and looked at the sky of her own planet, which she had not seen from outside a sealed window in 11 years, and I stood slightly behind her with my survey tablet, and I did not say a single word. She made a sound eventually. Low, brief, not distress, not that. Something that had been held for a very long time and found in that moment that it no longer needed to be held. The kind of sound that does not have a name in most languages because most languages are built by people who can go outside whenever they want. The guards, to their credit, did not speak either. Whatever they were thinking, they kept it to themselves. We stayed for 40 minutes. I took atmospheric readings that I did not need. She stood at the terrace edge, both hands on the railing, and looked out at the city that spread below the palace grounds, the Veth capital, which she had been positioned above for 3 centuries and which she was, now, actually seeing. On the way back she said, "We can add this to the regular session schedule." "I already put in for it," I said, "weekly, alternate Tuesdays." She nodded once, like the matter was settled. The matter was not settled, as it turned out. The Chamberlain called me to his office 2 days later. He sat across from me with the expression of someone who had been outmaneuvered several times in a row and had decided that direct conversation was the only remaining move. "You are systematic," he said. "I'm a researcher," I said. "You are dismantling the structure of her designation, one approved form at a time," he said. I put my hands together on the table. "I am conducting authorized research activities with a documented subject matter consultant. All activities are within the bounds of my consultancy terms. The terms you accepted when we expected you to accept them as a constraint," he said. That was the most honest thing anyone in the palace had said to me in 5 months. I respected it. "I know," I said. "I should tell you I don't have a play after this one. I am genuinely operating within the rules you gave me. If you close the gaps I find, I stop finding them. I am not here to break your system. I just think your system is breaking someone who has not done anything to deserve it." He looked at me for a long time. The Veth, when they are genuinely thinking, have a particular quality of stillness, not the trained stillness of the court, the real kind. "You care about outcomes," he said. "I am a medical professional," I said. "It is an occupational hazard." He did not respond to that. He looked at his desk. He picked up a stylus and set it down again. "Your consultancy contract comes up for renewal in 6 weeks, he said. "I know," I said. "I assumed you would not renew it." "I have not decided," he said. And that, from him, was significant enough that I carried it out of the room and turned it over for the rest of the day. My IHC contract had already been denied extension. Carol had sent me the official notification with a personal note that said simply, "I'm sorry, Marcus. The VETH government applied pressure. There is nothing I can do on my end." I had thanked her. I had not told her about the consultancy situation because it was not resolved yet, and I do not report things that are not resolved. I told Saravan on a Thursday evening session. The sessions had evolved. They were not intake forms and welfare checkboxes anymore. They were, I did not have a clean word for it. She had finished the 4 million texts in the library tablet by month 2, which I did not believe until she demonstrated it. And after that, our sessions had shifted into something closer to actual conversation. Long ones. She asked questions like someone who had been collecting them for years and had finally found a place to spend them. She asked about Earth, about cities, about what it was like to choose where to go, about music, about mathematics, about why humans build things that will only last 100 years and do not seem troubled by that. I answered all of it. She told me things too. Carefully at first, the way people test ice before stepping onto it, and then less carefully. The history of the palace from the inside. The political machinery she had been watching for centuries without any power to affect it. The things she had read in the botanical codex margins that the imperial scholars had not bothered to annotate because they had not thought the annotations important. She was, I had understood clearly by month 3, and simply let myself continue to understand, one of the most perceptive people I had ever met in any species. I told her about the IHC contract on a Thursday. She heard me out. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The consultancy renewal," she said, "that is also uncertain." "The Chamberlain hasn't decided," I said, "which is either good or bad, I'm not sure yet." She looked at her hands. She had a habit, I had noticed, of looking at her hands when she was thinking through something she had not thought through before. "There is a provision," she said. "In the dynastic law, my third tutor, the one I had between my 48th and 61st year, he taught me the foundational documents, all of them. He was very thorough." A pause. "He has been gone for 2 centuries. I think about his thoroughness sometimes." "What provision?" I said. "A member of the imperial bloodline may appoint a permanent diplomatic liaison from any recognized diplomatic body," she said. "The appointment is at the member's discretion. It cannot be refused by the administrative court. It requires only a formal petition filed under the bloodline provision and signed by 2 witness officials." I looked at her. "That is from the foundational dynastic law," I said. "Yes," she said. "The same law I used in the reclassification challenge," I said. "The same law," she said. "The same law you reminded this court existed." The room was very quiet. "You learned that from me," I said. "You use the rules the way water uses cracks," she said. She had said it to me months ago. She was saying it back to me now with a slight, careful something in her expression that, on a human face, I would have called a smile. "I have been watching you do it since the first day. I have had some time to study the technique." I put my hands on my knees. I looked at the floor. I did the thing I do when I need a moment, which is to find something physically neutral to focus on while the rest of me catches up. She had taken the tool I had built and turned it back toward the problem. She had used the old law, the same one I had found to make her consent matter, to make the choice herself. Not because I told her to. Not because I built it and handed it to her. Because she had been watching me find the cracks for 5 months and had found one herself. 312 years old, kept in political silence for 60 of them. And she had done in one quiet Thursday evening what it had taken me 4 months of filed documentation to approach from the outside. The petition required her signature, 2 witness signatures, and the formal designation of the liaison. IHC standing counted as a recognized diplomatic body. It had been established as such under the Accords. All of that was already on record. She filed it the following Monday. The two witnesses were both palace staff, individuals I had never directly spoken to, which meant she had arranged it herself, which meant she had conversations I did not know about, which meant she had been planning this with more patience and precision than I had given her credit for, which was on me for underestimating someone who had spent 3 centuries watching political machinery operate from inside it. The administrative court received it on Wednesday. The Chamberlain called me to his office on Thursday. He looked tired in a way that was not physical. The Veth don't tire that way. It was the tiredness of someone who has been very good at a thing for a very long time and has met a problem that is not solvable by being good at that thing. The petition is valid, he said. I know, I said. The provision has no override mechanism. I know that too, I said. He studied me. She did this without consulting you, he said. It was not entirely a question. She did, I said. She's quite capable of that. People tend to underestimate how capable she is. I think it's because she was quiet for so long. He was still for a long moment. You are not what we expected, he said finally. When your transit pod sent you to the wrong wing, we looked at your file, grade 3 species worker, botanical survey. We thought you were a mistake that would correct itself. I am definitely a mistake, I said. I correct very slowly. Something passed across his face, not warmth exactly. The Veth run cool on warmth as a species, but something in the range of it. She has not filed a petition independently in 60 years, he said. She has not done many things independently in 60 years. I did not say anything. Your appointment is confirmed, he said. The petition stands. You are the permanent diplomatic liaison to Princess Saravin Dho. He picked up his stylus. I trust you understand the responsibility that carries. I've been a nurse, I said. Responsibility I can do. He nodded once and looked at his desk. Conversation over. I walked out. The corridor was the same polished obsidian, the same scale, the same architecture that had made me feel like an insect the first time I stood in it. I did not feel like an insect. I told her that evening, not about the Chamberlain specifically. She would get the formal notification through her own channels. I told her it was confirmed. She was sitting in the northeast corner of the assessment room. The window in her residence had been open that morning. I had checked the log because I still could, because old habits, for 2 hours at dawn. She looked at me when I told her. You are staying, she said. I am staying, I said. She looked at her hands, then out the window, then back at me. The gold line markings on her face had that brighter quality they got in moments of something I had stopped trying to classify and had started just nodding. The rain recording, she said. You gave it to me in the 2nd month. I have listened to it every night since. I had not known that. Does it help? I asked. It makes the room feel less sealed, she said, like something real is happening just outside. I thought about that. When the terrace sessions are on the schedule consistently, I said, you will not need the recording as much. I know, she said, I will still listen to it. We sat in the quiet for a while. The kind of quiet that is not empty, the kind that has things in it that do not need to be said because saying them would only reduce them. She asked me eventually what home felt like. I thought about Chicago, the lake in November, the sound of traffic at 300 when the city had thinned but not stopped, the particular noise of a city that does not ever fully go quiet because there are too many people who need it to stay on for them. Loud, I said, home feels loud. She was quiet for a moment. I have never lived anywhere loud, she said. I know, I said. I would like to, she said, not to me specifically, just out loud, just the words placed into the room belonging to her. I looked at the window. The Veth Prime sky had shifted into its evening layering. the silver from the secondary star washing up from the horizon, while the primary dropped gold behind the palace roofline. "You've got time," I said. She nodded once, in the way she had started nodding at certain things, not agreement exactly, but recognition. The nod of someone building a picture piece by piece and finding that the pieces are starting to match. "I have been practicing," she said. And she had. I had watched her do it. Every window opened at 4:30, every question asked without waiting to be addressed, every pressed leaf left by a vine, every margin annotation, every petition filed with the quiet precision of someone who has been watching the machinery for 3 centuries and has finally decided that she is allowed to touch it. Loud is not just volume. It is the decision to take up space, to leave marks, to say your name in a room that has spent years not saying it for you. She was learning it the way someone learns a language, piece by piece, sentence by sentence, until the day it stops being translation and starts being thought. I was staying. The paperwork said so. The ancient law she had found in the same archive I had pointed her toward said so. The chamberlain with his tired eyes and his stylus said so. But I had known before the paperwork. I had known on the day she said my name in that court chamber, not because it changed the legal situation, although it did, eventually, in ways I had used, but because of what it had cost her and what she had chosen to spend it on. You learn a lot about people in crisis. 6 years of trauma work. You learn what they reach for when everything else is stripped down, what they hold on to, what they let go of to hold on to it. She had held on. 3 centuries of it, and she had held on. And then a human botanist had taken the wrong transit pod on a Tuesday morning and wandered into the wrong wing of an ancient empire. And she had looked through a 2-inch gap in a door and decided, apparently, that this particular mistake was worth keeping an eye on. I thought that was about right. I closed my survey tablet. I looked at the sky that was doing its evening colors outside the window. "Home feels loud." She nodded like she already knew. Like she had been practicing.